Hello, one and all. I sincerely hope someone receives this call. My name is Dollbones, and I wish to speak of a story, one that is particularly frightful and gory. A tale from the year 2012, a forgotten gem into which we shall delve. The creepypasta known as Her Picture. So to all you misses and misters, let us make this darkness more inviting and start reading some creepy writing. Written by Akhenaton and posted on January 15th, 2012. Please enjoy the original story before listening to my review. This creepypasta comes to us from the classic era of story posting. A time when everything was about creating the next Jeff the Killer or Slender Man. But this story was always one that stood out to me. I don't want to spoil the incredible twist that comes in this story, so I highly suggest that you find some way to experience the original story on your own before hearing my thoughts on it. All caught up? Then let's start with our first section of the review. Her Picture is a very short but effective creepypasta. It delivers on its premise and doesn't overstay its welcome. The setup is very believable for the most part, though it is rather cliché, admittedly. I mean, an extremely nice house for sale at a price much cheaper than expected. It's one of the oldest tricks in the book, to the point where anyone in real life would raise an eyebrow at such a thing. But of course, horror story characters rarely have that level of awareness to them, now do they? While I will say the story has a believable setup, lots of things throughout the story just flat out don't make sense and feel rather contrived. The protagonist somehow being able to unlock the door by jamming a paperclip into it at random is easily the biggest one in my opinion. I feel like the author should have just had the main character find a key hidden somewhere, but it is a relatively small moment in what is otherwise a very well done story. The story really gets going once the protagonist makes their way through the hidden door. Right off the bat, I appreciate the strange and mysterious vibe that the author builds up in here. Here, allow me to read you a small excerpt from the story. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the abyss to find a decayed flight of stairs with a broken rail. In the very distance I could make out a decrepit floor that seemed stained by something, but I wasn't sure. I shone my flashlight around me to reveal the details of the secret room, and to my astonishment the room was extremely fancy. The floor was made entirely of marble, the walls had fine art on them, veils hung from the ceiling as decoration, and the room was lined with gold. There was nothing in the high-class room aside from the paintings. For some reason, the room reminded me of an old-time barber shop or something. It seemed too nice. Immediately we're enticed with the mention of the room having a stain on its decrepit floor, something that's never touched upon again, directly I might add. It's never mentioned again after this point, and while some may chalk this up to being a loose end, I personally disagree. I feel like by the end of the story we're given more than enough context to figure out what that is and why it's there. But that's something that I quite appreciate when it comes to this story. The author really doesn't hold your hand here. A lot of things are left up to your own deductions to solve. It's a very delicate balance that a writer has to strike. It's extremely easy to fall into the trap of not explaining enough or explaining too much. But in this case, I feel like Akhenaton does a great job of treading the line. The things that are left unexplained leave a lot of room for the imagination to try and fill in the gaps. Take, for example, the passage I just read to you. It's never really explained why the first room is designed the way it is, why it's so fancy and decorative, but through the inclusion of the piece of fine art, we can deduce that the original owner had some kind of appreciation for these things. And this would later further clue us in on why he selected that very specific and gruesome punishment for the woman. I feel like this air of uncertainty also helps build on the atmosphere that the story gives us, particularly throughout the protagonist's original venture into the hidden rooms, during which we're given several of what I would call false leads, things that are meant to make us think something supernatural is going on here. The mention of the cracks in the wall looking like claw marks, for example, or the protagonist thinking they were being followed only for it to turn out to be a spider web. Not only do these small moments help build the mystery of what exactly happened in here, but they also make a lot of sense. We're seeing this story through the eyes of a child, after all, you have to remember. Their overactive imagination could make even something as mundane as cracks in a wall seem horrific. All of this mystery and uncertainty builds exquisitely into the big twist at the end of this tale. The protagonist coming to realize that what they thought was a picture was, in reality, a window. It's exactly the kind of twist that makes a standout horror story. The kind of uneasy, stomach-sinking realization that is very, very hard to capture in fiction like this. Of course, it does raise a few questions, like how the protagonist was unable to tell a window from a picture in the first place. Even if the room was dark, I feel like the depth perception there would have still easily given it away. But the execution is honestly so well done that I feel like it could be hand-waved away as just the protagonist being too scared to really take notice of what they were seeing. Although I have a lot of praise for this twist, I feel like the ending just goes on for a little bit too long. Had the story ended right there, right in the moment where the protagonist has their revelation, it would have been 1,000 times more impactful in my opinion. The current ending just goes on for a tad too long. I mean, the inclusion of the protagonist telling their parents, and the description of the police breaking down the window, recovering the corpse, arresting the man, etc., all of that just serves little to no purpose in the story. It is quite funny, just earlier I mentioned how easy it is for a writer to fall into the trap of over-explaining things, and this is absolutely one of those instances. We didn't need to have that final paragraph explaining the aftermath. It's all things we could have easily assumed would happen next. And compared to the rest of the story, it's a very disappointing case of over-explaining. All in all, I think I'll have to rate the story a 4 out of 5. The suspense and strangeness of the mystery, followed by that swift and impactful delivery of the twist, is all so well done. Held back by only a few things, like some minor plot contrivances and the wasted potential of a good ending. This section is going to certainly be much shorter than the last. The characters in this story certainly aren't a high point, but it's very clear that they're not supposed to be. The people in this story clearly aren't meant to be memorable characters. I think that idea is very apparent in the fact that we don't even receive a single name in this entire story. We don't even know what the protagonist's gender is. So, in my opinion, they're used more as tools to portray the story's idea with. Let's start with the protagonist, simply because it's the only character you really can say anything about. But even then, there's not much. They're a bland self-insert, nameless and faceless, aside from the single description of them being overweight. Like I said a moment ago, it's clear that this character is simply meant to just be a tool for the story. Someone for the audience to see through and experience the horrors through. They're left vague enough that anyone, regardless of gender or ethnicity, can identify and see through the eyes of this character. The only other character that I feel inclined to even talk about in this section is the woman herself. Now you may be asking me, Dollbones, is this woman really a character? Well, I would argue that she is, or rather was. Of course, she is the main focal point of the story, but what I enjoy most about her is that we're left with a character that is entirely an enigma. We don't know a single thing about her. We don't know what she did, or who she was. Obviously, she was the victim of this brutal murder, but you have to ask yourself what exactly she did to warrant such a brutal death. It's entirely possible that she did nothing wrong, that the former owner of the house was a maniac that took his psychotic anger out upon her. Maybe she just tried to break up with him, or maybe she just did something that he didn't like. But it's equally likely that she was no saint either. Maybe she cheated on him, maybe she broke his heart, maybe she committed atrocities in her own right. She could have easily been abusive or a monster herself. We have no idea. Just like how I feel the ambiguity of the overall story works in his benefit, I feel like that works here as well. Of course, regardless of how she was in life, it doesn't justify what the former owner of the house did to her. but I still feel like it's an interesting idea to consider. Although I feel like the lack of strong characters and ambiguity to the whole thing is part of the point, it doesn't exactly change the fact that the characters barely exist. And although there is nothing wrong with having characters that simply serve as a tool for the story, it's not going to give them any real points in this category. All I can really give them is a 1 out of 5 here, simply because I do think that there is some things to talk about there, and some interesting points to consider with some of these characters. The writing of her picture is solid. I have no real complaints over the way it was written. Grammar and spelling are good for the most part, aside from 1 or 2 misused hyphens, or a word not being capitalized like it should be, or a couple run-on sentences here or there. But I would like to further analyze one specific part of the story. Arguably the most important part of the story itself, the author's description of the woman. Since the entire creepypasta is focused around this one particular moment, I feel like it's worth analyzing all on its own. So allow me to read that part to you to properly establish the scene. The picture seemed to be of a woman. She had been brutally tortured and beaten. She bore a Chelsea grin extending all the way to her ears. Her left eye was missing, her hair had been burned off, her upper lip had been cut off and removed, revealing her entire gum line, which was also clearly plagued with extremely severe gingivitis, and the rest of her entire face was covered in blood, cuts, and bruises as well. What was most disturbing, however, was her skin. It varied in hue, sometimes a human peach, sometimes a moldy green. It seemed as if her skin began to grow a fungus, and that said fungus was causing her skin to rupture. Numerous boils plagued her complexion, and it almost seemed like her skin was peeling or melting off. Someone had carved a haunting smile into the side of her neck, eerily similar to her Glasgow smile. On the other side of her neck, coming down to the top of her torso, were the words carved, "I am a fucking whore." I have both things I like and dislike about this section of the story. First of all, let's get the good things out of the way. The author does a really good job of painting a mental picture in your head. The image is detailed enough that you really get a good grasp of what you're looking at. So much so that I even swore at one point that the story had an image attached, only to realize that it was just a false memory I had. That being said, the author does get quite clunky in said description. Though I appreciate them for being so detailed, it's very clumsy in its execution. The section is a mess of commas and parentheses and sentences with no subject that just run on, and I don't think it's so bad to the point where it ruins the scene, but it definitely turns reading it into a bit of a chore, more than it otherwise would be. To the point where it took me numerous tries just to record that reading because I kept getting tripped up over the sentences and running out of breath. One last thing to mention before we move on. I quite like the pacing of this story. It doesn't overstay its welcome and is quick to get to the point. It's only after 6 paragraphs that the protagonist is trying to find their way into the secret room. We don't have too much needless exposition setting up the house or the family or the protagonist's friends, and I feel like this is due in part to the protagonist themselves just being a blank slate. But I still do enjoy how quick of a read this is. It's a story that knows what it wants to portray and does it swiftly and thoroughly. Something I appreciate in creepypastas and something that I find lacking in today's era of no-sleep stories. And something I myself am quite guilty of in my own writing from time to time. I would give the writing a solid 3 out of 5. It's good and holds up well, only facing a few minor issues here and there, but that's something to really be expected with any amateur writer. And although it's decent, the writing doesn't really leave you feeling astounded or impressed either. So I think a perfectly middle-of-the-road score works here. This is certainly the most subjective part of the whole review, but let's face it, It's the whole reason we read these stories, isn't it? It's difficult for a story to really be creepy. Even though I think many creepypastas out there are good stories, I find that many of them fail to truly creep me out. Now, again, this is speaking entirely from my subjective viewpoint. You may feel differently about this part than I do, and that's completely fine, but me personally, I do feel like this story earns the right to be called creepy. As I've spoken about throughout this review, I feel like Akhenaton delivers a very solid, mysterious, and creepy atmosphere. From the moment the protagonist opens that hidden door, every part of the story builds beautifully from one point to the next, slowly increasing that tension and mystery of this place, finally culminating in the protagonist coming face to face with the titular painting. Although this isn't the creepiest part for me, I do think it's important to try and put yourself in this situation. Finding such a creepy shrine beneath your new house would certainly frighten anyone. Although this on its own isn't enough to make a story be considered creepy. After all, if I was face to face with a knife-wielding lunatic, I'd be terrified, but reading something like that on the page doesn't really creep me out. No, the real creep factor, of course, comes at the twist. The realization that it was a window holding a mutilated corpse the whole time. I still remember the way my jaw dropped when the realization hit me. My stomach sank, and I just remember thinking, oh my god. Part of the reason why it was so creepy was because it was done so subtly. It's not like the character went back down there and accidentally broke the glass or something. It was through something as subtle and simple as finding the receipt from the materials used to build her prison. This would have been a perfect 5 in the creep factor category if it just weren't for that damn ending again. It really does drag this whole story down in every which way, and I really wish it hadn't been included. It removes some of the creepiness by giving the story of a more defined resolution, and will unfortunately drop the story down from a perfect 5 in the score. I'm gonna have to give it a 4 out of 5 here. So, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of the evening, these are the scores for her picture. Story, 4 out of 5. Character, 1 out of 5. Writing, 3 out of 5. Creep factor, 4 out of 5. That leaves us with a total score of 12 out of 20. Just about the halfway mark, which I think is more than suitable. Although I enjoy the story a lot and do believe it is well written and a good read, outside of the twist, a lot of it isn't quite so memorable. Its writing is middle of the road, it features practically non-existent characters, but beyond all that, it is a very interesting and mysterious story, one that leaves you questioning everything right up until the point where the big twist is revealed. A satisfying score for our first review. I hope you won't mind sharing your thoughts too. Write me a letter or send me a sign, any way you deem to be fine. In the comments below I await your reply, assuming the fright didn't make you die. Until next time, my friends, I bid you farewell. This has been Dollbones, your host, live from Dollhouse Hell.